Think of artists like Paula and Bryson, where you can hear every individual element in the track. Everything is well separated, yet it fills the full spectrum from the bottom right to the top. And you've got all those different parts and elements working together to give you that full spectrum of sound, but nothing crosses over one another. You can always pick out the hi-hat, the snare, the kick, the vocal, the synths, and it all sits in really great context. Well, in this video, we're going to talk about some of the techniques and methods that we can use to make sure your tracks get that. First off, let's think about sound selection. There's a reason that the drum break contains 3 key elements: a kick drum, a snare drum, and a hi-hat. They fill the spectrum. Your kick drum sits down here going ka-dum, ka-dum, ka-dum. Your snare goes dum, ka, dum, ka. And then your hi-hat goes across the top. Let's look at some examples of this in the context of a track and some sound choices. So what we've got here, we've got bass, a break, some hi-hats and effects, and a vocal. And they've not got any effects on, no filtering, nothing. And yet we'll still be able to perceive all of those individual elements when we play it back.
Raised you up, but you took no notice of everything I did. Oh, everything I did.
For example, if we take the hi-hats away, bring them in, they've got their own space right away. Same with the vocal and the effects. They're all there in layers, and even the break and the bass can play nice together. So here we can see everything that's in the bass. We've got these big tones down here and this big fundamentals, the main sort of body of it with all the harmonics rolling off here. All right, we add the break into that and the break can fill out all of this space here, but we'd worry a little bit about the kick drum. Well, we can see the kick drum has got a different fundamental frequency to the bass. So when the two are in together, they actually don't fight each other. If the kick drum was lower down and hitting around here, they'd be fighting the whole time. Now there is a harmonic in the bass, absolutely, at this point here, but it's quite quiet compared to the rest of the sound. So they're a good choice to go together and already have that separation. Now there's some hi-hats and other tops going on, but there's quite a lot of space in sort of this area of the break. If we add these hi-hats in, there you go, instantly filling out a different space, and they're not fighting with one another. Now if we look at the frequency spectrum, there's a big old gap right here. If we just double click that, you see we're sort of like the 500 range all the way through to the 1K range, which is going to be sort of the fundamental range here of Deggs' vocal. Boom, and you see that area fill out as well. So hopefully that can highlight to you just how important sound selection is. Now, let's not cheat the system, have the vocal extra loud. Let's dip it down 6 dB, sort of balanced a bit more with everything else on that spectrum, still standing out. For argument's sake, a kick drum is going to be around 100 Hz, and the fundamental of the snare, because it has a lot of high-end energy, is going to be around the 200 Hz. So they're 100 Hz apart, giving us some room to play depending on key and whatnot. They're not hard numbers. Then the hi-hat's going to sit right up in your top end, maybe ticking away at 3 to 5K, leaving all that space in the middle for something else to sit in. Today's video is sponsored by DistroKid. They let me get my music out to all of the major distributors, and they do that at a price an independent artist can easily afford. If you're ready to get your music or beats out there and want to release an unlimited amount of music each year, check the link in the description below for a discount off of your first year of unlimited distribution with DistroKid. We can identify the vocal, no problem. We can identify the backing vocals, no problem. We can latch onto that Reese and define that, absolutely no issue. We can hear the sample chords and melodies, and we can pick out the hi-hat, the snare and the kick drum in the break. Now if we look at our Reese session here, what is important in the equalizer here, I'm actually taking out this fundamental most of the time to balance it. And the kick drum always sits in that space as well. If we were to open up, say, the HEQ here, and we can actually see the kick drum. And we can see that fundamental sitting around the same space that we're taking out here. Now if we were to play the Reese back by itself, and we were to turn this off, you know, allow it to have the full response back, well, it's a lot beefier, it's a lot more weighty, right? But at no point is the Reese necessarily happening when we want that weightiness in. The kick drum fills that space completely fine from the break. And we're thinking, it sounds great. And sure, it sounds great soloed out like this. It's doing its own thing. It's big, filled out sound, especially when we take this away, right? Oof, it's just this big, beautiful sound, but it doesn't work in the mix. And losing this low frequency in context, which we could potentially just filter away, doesn't diminish it at all. The kick drum's always in there. We don't miss it. It fills that space just fine. And when we listen back to this, the snare and hi-hat aren't fighting. We can see this all rolls off nicely, because we've got quite a bit of energy up here in our drum break. If we open up these three different spectrums right here, you can kind of see how they could all work together, right? The bass has got lots of energy here around this point, and we're taking out this low fundamental to make sure the fundamental weight of the kick can come through. All that bass energy is sitting around here, where there's the least amount in the drum break. Now in terms of the strings, they're sitting right up in the middle area, so sort of all around here, just where the snare cuts through really, and you can see that and hear that with the rhythm going on here. The Reese wobbles up now and then, and it's rhythmic, but it's in between the drum beats, so it doesn't fight with the snare, it's going in between those two spaces, back and forth. And the strings just sit in that space consistently, but they're obscured every now and then by the bass rising up and the snare kicking through. But because it's so quick, we don't really notice it. The whole strings still sound like they're there. We need to think about that when we structure the track together. For example, if we look at the Reese again, soloed, let's say we decided we want a big old lift here, and that sounds wicked. We like that, and we want our low end in. And it does sound pretty cool, right? It's pretty, yeah, beefy and ripping. Problem is, that's now going to start obscuring all this area of the strings a lot more frequently, and it's probably going to start obscuring our snare as well, even though it's nice and rhythmical. See how much more separated that is and how much more focus comes into the strings and drums when we take that back? Now it's obviously an over-exaggerated example. It is sound design, but I'd very unlikely put a, 12 dB boost, 11 dB boost in there. But the difference is clear. It obscures the focus of the other elements. Another simple thing with sound design as well is, say your bass and your kick have got that same kind of fundamental sound. Well, on the bass, make it so it ramps up. So when you do trigger that bass right as the kick comes in, it has a little ramp up before it brings that low end frequency in, and the kick will hit nice and quickly and it'll ramp up and move in together. Then there's the obvious factor of mixing, where we've got EQ, filters, multiband compression, dynamic EQ, sidechain compression, and all those different tools we can use, and they've all got utilization in different ways to create different types of separation. Let's have a look at some concepts and examples so you can actually hear what's going on and hopefully better understand it. Let's say perhaps the bass in the track is in the way of something else. So let's take the drum break. Let's take the Reese in here. Now we've got our bass channel here, we've got our break channel. They can take the sample out. So we've just got these two. So in this particular instance, I've got Pro MB on here. And what we can see here is that Audio 6 is feeding into Pro MB, and that is the break. And at key moments when the break pops in, you can see the kick knocks the sound down here by about 3 dB or so. And when the snare pops in, it knocks it back by about 2 dB up here. We could take that a whole lot further if we've got a bigger conflict going on. So what we could do here, for example, is let's add in Pro Q3. Any EQ that has a notch filter is going to do the job here for us. So this is on our bass, and the reason I'm using this EQ is because I can do this and show you what's going on by going into audio and grabbing Audio 6, which is the break. I can select the sidechain, and we can now see that in with our bass and exactly how the two are working together. We talked before about choosing sounds where like the fundamental frequencies don't overlap. We can see that the kick comes in between two frequencies of the bass most of the time. There are particular notes in the bass where it does overlap, absolutely. Now somewhere around here, it's going to be our fundamental of our snare. We just select on that, we're going to see somewhere around the 200 Hertz range, and we can hear it and see it pop up. Now let's say that our bass is masking that. There is absolutely no reason we can't go absolutely extreme and do something like this. Clearly, we've taken far too much out of the bass right there. If we narrow that notch down a bit, we can find, it's going to be about there, those key frequencies that sit through in the drum break. Now, as long as our drum break and our bass are always going to be playing together, we don't miss anything in that sound, do we? We can disable this. There's nothing missing in the Reese, even though we've cut a big chunk out, because it's filled by that break fundamental part of the sound that's always there. If we were having some kind of obstruction going on with the highs, look at using our filters and maybe even curve off the Reese. Take out any of that high end to rebalance it up. Again, we're not missing anything in the Reese by doing this. It just gives us a much more clear focus on all the highs and the important things that are going on. But this is where we need to talk about automation, in where these two things might not always have exactly the same relationship. And it's times like that that you'd want to automate. So for example, let's say there is a section in this track where the bass rolls along and there is no break. And in fact, that does happen at another point in the track. For example, let's say here where we have a bit of a breakdown section, perhaps there was no break intended to be in that part. And we decide to roll out with something like this. Well, that's when we need to start looking at automation, and we would maybe automate this to come back and allow us to have those highs back in that bass, and potentially disable this. Or alternatively, automate its frequency so it goes out of spectrum. Then when the break was to come back in, we'd bring it back into where it needs to be and block those sounds off again, which makes automation massively key. If you want to see how different types of automation are used, I will link a video in the description below or up at the top right now, where I explain in depth the different types of automation that we use. Now, obviously I touched on it for a second, but I'd be regress if we didn't look at the normal kind of sidechain. The more traditional, less detailed and intricate side of the sidechain is just as valuable. So let's mute both of the Pro EQ and Pro MB on here and just put a stock Logic compressor. And if we load up my preset here, it's called a FET Sidey. I like using the Studio FET because it adds a load of noise, and that kind of gives like a movement and rhythm added into the sound, just to bring another benefit in there. So again, we can use the sidechain option here and just route our break into it, Audio 6. Now we've got the whole drum break routed into this. This is going to send this all over the place in terms of a sidechain, right? It's smashing it down at all times. What we need to do here is make sure we utilize a filter, much like we would in an EQ. This time we're going to isolate just the areas we want to be affected. So if we put listen on the filter, we're going to hear the drum break twice. And now there's no bass whatsoever. For example, if we were to solo the bass, we're now hearing the drum break because we've got this listen filter on. And this is going to let us narrow down what we need to be. Now mode could go in low pass and we could just bring it right down, just pick up all the low end. I often put it in band pass, let us be a little bit more accurate, and we can find just that kick. And from here, this is set up how I already like it. Feel free to copy if you're making D&B. And I'll just dial in the threshold now to where I want it to be based on that kick. And you can see, it's now just taking it down a few dB in the kind of settings that I like. And now when we put the filter on, we're back to our bass, and it's being dipped out by just the kick in that drum break. And again, that's creating a little bit of space for that kick drum to punch through. But this time it's taking the whole of the bass down and adding an extra rhythm to it. In this track I didn't want to do that, which is why I used the Pro MB to just pull down the low end at those key moments instead. But here we are in context. Just lets that drum punch through. And it's just a little bit harder to pick out without it there. Obviously we can wildly exaggerate this by nailing the threshold down, if you so desire. That's far too extreme for me, and I like more of a subtle balance. Somewhere between the 3 and 5 dB mark tends to work pretty well. In summary, if you want to get that separation, those defined separate sounds in your final mix, it starts early on with the sound selection and the choices you're making when you're designing sounds, selecting sounds, choosing the key you're going to work in, the production of the track itself and the overall melodies and how everything's going to sit together before you even get to that separation and slicing out in the mixing stage. It'll make things so much easier for you at that stage when things are already separated element wise and you can hear all the parts in the mix before you start applying filters and cutting things away, applying sidechain compression to duck other things away, and getting really technical. If you start off with the fundamentals of good sound selection and good arrangement and good sound design, it's going to be very easy to get this separation at the mix stage. I really hope that's been helpful for you, and if you like producing this type of music, you should check out this video next where I do a track completely from scratch and you can even download the template. I look forward to seeing you in that one. Take care.